I can see it. Are you uncomfortable?
No.
Because I'm fine.
Okay, you're fine.
Yeah, I can see.
Then
You get comfortable. I'm fine. I can see it.
you can see it.
Okay.
All right. Just want to make sure that you can see that this thing is not. I've learned that if I do this, I'm not looking like that. You see the top of my head where I'm, which I used to do. I used to be in there, and Linda McElroy came up and said, Mayor, we Okay, Kelly. We're ready to begin.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone, joining the virtual event commemorating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the importance it has played in women's right to vote. Although not every woman was granted the right to vote with the ratification, more work was needed and has been done since its ratification. This was an integral start to women's voices being heard at the ballots. I asked Dee Dee Wright to join me today because it was Dee Dee's idea to commemorate this wonderful event today and this special part of our history as women. And so she is joining me here in the office. We originally had thought that it would be a hosted as a luncheon, but as things turned out with COVID, we decided we would still do it, but it would become a virtual event. We have two speakers joining us today. Mary Rudin, artist of suffragist Lizzie Crozier French bust, which is on display at City Hall. And we have Kara Dedman, curator of the North Carolina Capitol. We will first hear from Mary Rudin. We will also have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. So please note any questions that you have in the chat box where it says questions and answers. And then we will decide which of our presenters is most appropriate to answer those questions. And we will do that at the end of the program after each speaker has spoken. So at this time, I'm going to present the proclamation for this wonderful event, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Whereas August 18, 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, giving women the right to vote. And whereas many notable suffragists were born or worked in North Carolina, including Charlotte Hawkins Brown, Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Thompson Cowper, and Gertrude Weil. And whereas Congress passed the 19th Amendment on June 4th, 1919, and it was ratified into law on August 18, 1920, when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And whereas the United States Secretary of State issued a proclamation on August 26, 1920, that the 19th Amendment was officially a part of the United States Constitution. And August 26th is celebrated as Women's Equality Day throughout the United States. And whereas the city of Salisbury is home to an estimated 17,500 females, and whereas women's right to vote has enhanced the political discourse in Salisbury and paved the way for over 25 years of leadership by female mayors. Now, therefore, I, Karen K. Alexander, Mayor of the City of Salisbury, North Carolina, and on behalf of the Salisbury City Council and the citizens of Salisbury, do hereby proclaim Tuesday, August 18, 2020, as the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Be it further resolved that I do hereby proclaim Wednesday, August 26, 2020, as Women's Equality Day in Salisbury in honor and recognition of the role women have played since the 1920s elections by using the power of their vote to help shape the landscape of local, state, and national political arenas. This, the 18th day of August 2020, Karen K. Alexander, Mayor of the City of Salisbury. So thank you. And at this time, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Mary Rudin. She taught art at the college level for over 8 years. Her artwork and sculpture is in public art projects in several states. She was awarded a preservation award by the Knox Heritage East Tennessee Preservation Alliance. Her bronze statues and recent quilts feature historic people and events, such as the Centennial of Women's Right to Vote. She has an online portfolio with the North American Orchid Conservation Center, an affiliate of the Smithsonian, and at her website, maryrudin.com. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Mary Rudin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. And this is a wonderful event, and I'm so glad that you thought of commemorating it in this way. And I hope that everybody can come and take a look at this beautiful statue that they were so nice of. It was so nice of them to put on display at City Hall. I'm very pleased to say it's there in Salisbury. It's of Lizzie Crozier French. She was very much a forerunner in the women's suffrage movement. Now, she was from Knoxville, Tennessee, but she had national roots as well, and she was very active with the National Woman's Party in Washington, D.C. And I know we'll have a little question and answer, but I've made a little video that tells a lot about her because many people don't know much about her. And I don't know in what order we're going to do things, but maybe we'll play the video soon. Robert, we have a problem. Here it comes.
Against the hazy skyline in the hills of Appalachia stands the skeleton of a factory that once catapulted the American South into a labor revolution. What began as a group of female rayon workers walking out in a peaceful protest of unfair working conditions escalated into a strike that led to the deployment of the Tennessee National Guardsmen and ultimately culminated in federal workers' rights legislation. In Elizabethton, Tennessee, a unique union of poor, tough, hard-working mountain women dressed up in high heels and their Sunday best and stood up for their right to strike. These women pioneered a wave of strikes that swept across the Southern textile industry. The revolution for Southern laborers' rights began with the Rayon Girls. On hill, say what you will. I done made the devil hurt you.
If they don't give us that raise, we'll just quit work.
Yeah, we was awful rough in the bunch. The story of the rights of the Rayon Girls takes root in the Reconstruction period that occurred after the Civil War. The Old South's plantation economy collapse did not erase the lifestyle lived in Appalachian communities, like Elizabethton, Tennessee. The turn of the century gave rise to the Progressive Movement. Progressives sought to improve society through reform movements, including fighting for women's voting rights. In 1920, Tennessee delivered the crucial 36th ratification for the 19th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote for women. Many Southern women were inspired by the newfound independence suffrage brought. Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution led to the extensive spread of factories in the United States. In this area, the progressives favored reform of workers' rights through unionization. Union-led strikes in the textile mills of the northern United States derailed the unchecked industrial growth of the region. At the time, it was commonly held that an employee was solely responsible for his or her own safety, even in a dangerous work environment. The progressives lobbied for the passage of the Employers' Liability Act. This law recognized that the employer had a responsibility to create a safe work environment. A consequence of these tightened governmental regulations was that factories were moved from the heavily unionized North to the loosely organized South. This migration was dubbed a New South movement.
2020 is the centennial anniversary of women's right to vote. My name is Mary Rudin, and I'm the artist that created this bronze statue of Lizzie Crozier French. Lizzie is a Knoxville suffragist and was a women's rights activist, social reformer, and organizer. In 1885, she founded the literary society Ossory Circle. The same year, French co-founded a school, the East Tennessee Female Institute, serving as principal. She wrote the textbook, A Manual of Elocution, for her students. French organized the Women's Educational and Industrial Union in 1889 to improve conditions for working women. A prolific public speaker, she was the first woman to address the Knoxville City Council in 1890. French co-founded the Knoxville Writers Club in 1907. In the fight to ratify the 19th Amendment, She organized the Knoxville Equal Suffrage League in 1910, serving as its first president. French was president of the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs from 1910 to 1912. The first woman to address the Bar Association, she delivered an address on women's rights in 1912, demanding equal legal status for women. French served as state chair of the National Woman's Party in 1917. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, her nonpartisan municipal league registered twice as many women to vote in Knoxville than in any other southern city. French was an honorary president of the Tennessee League of Women's Voters. Her work led to Knoxville's first kindergarten, first hospital, an industrial school, a rest home for elderly women, juvenile court, and co-education at the University of Tennessee. She's buried at the historic Old Gray Cemetery in downtown Knoxville, Tennessee, and we are installing a bronze marker for her in the fall of 2020. It will be very informational and very attractive, and a miniature of this statue will be on it. We hope you can come and visit Old Gray Cemetery. I've created several quilts to honor the centennial 2020 for the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. This particular quilt has 12 ladies who were instrumental to the cause. And I have little information blocks at the bottom that list their names and what they were known for. Some of them are quite famous. You might recognize Carrie Chapman Catt, and everyone in here is very instrumental to the cause. And I used the yellow roses, which symbolize the amendment being passed. And so I've just gone with that theme, and I've tried to express it this way. All of my ancestors were suffragists, and I grew up hearing lots of stories of their interaction with this. So I thought of a way of weaving their lives literally into the art and the quilts to tell the story. So I have so many pictures and tintypes and things. I had them printed into the fabric, and then I hand paint parts of it. And so my ancestors are in the quilts forever, trying to express the theme and convey the idea, little miniatures of them and so on. I happen to think that sort of the matriarch is Susan B. Anthony. She did not live long enough to see women's right to vote, but everybody knows her, and this was one of her slogans, "Independence is happiness." And I thought that was marvelous, so I put her in a lot of the quilts, and many of the quilts have parts of my grandmother's quilts in them that are over 100 years old. This is Alice Paul at the National Woman's Party headquarters. She's the one who made the flag, and each star represented the state that was required for the amendment to be passed.
Mary, do you want to talk about your stamps?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess I went crazy with the theme of women's suffrage, and I've been a long-time stamp collector, and I realized that for important events such as World's Fairs and things like that, an artist can design something called a pictorial postmark. And what that is, as you know, when you mail a letter or anything like that at the post office, they have to stamp it and cancel out the stamp. So an artist can apply for permits from the post office and design something that coordinates with a particular event. And it took about 4 months to gain approval from the post office, but I designed this particular postage stamp. I designed 2 postage stamps that are actual postage stamps. One is of Lizzie Crozier French, the one on the bottom that's shown here that's purple. And the one that's yellow at the top is the yellow roses to symbolize the vote. Remember, it was called the War of the Roses. All the men wore a red rose in their collar that day, and only Harry T. Byrne changed his red rose for the yellow rose at the last minute, and that's when everything was ratified. So the stamp cancel, I have to return to the post office in about 60 days, and they destroy it, and then they give it back to me as a relic. So I can only stamp letters or whatever for about 60 days, but they will be collectible. And I also designed the design that you see on the left-hand side of the envelopes. I had a couple hundred envelopes printed with those designs. So this is all to commemorate this event. I thought it was a good opportunity and that I should take it. And I'm glad I did, because then it just is part of history.
So do you have more to present, Mary?
I thought that everything pretty much was in the video, and I really am appreciative of the opportunity to show the statue at City Hall. And I was glad to illustrate more detail about what Lizzie Crozier French was known for, because a lot of people have heard her name, but they don't realize how many things she was responsible for in her lifetime, which really is truly amazing. And it does go to show you that the efforts of one person can really make a difference. And she dedicated her life to trying to get the right to vote and women's suffrage and things for women and to have a better quality of life for women. So I think she's really a hero. And some people now are calling women heroes sheroes. So I guess she's a shero of mine.
That's wonderful. I was just going to point out also that they had several African-American women suffragists, Ida B. Wells, and there was the other. And I wanted to also point out that when I read the proclamation, 2 of the women noted from North Carolina who were actually born in North Carolina, they did most of their work in Tennessee and other states, but their names were Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Anna Julia Cooper. And so I thought that was noteworthy. And I believe Kara's going forward on the next presentation is going to tell us more about that. But thank you, Mary, for your excellent presentation. We really appreciate all the hard work, and we're so excited to have your the bust here in City Hall. And hopefully before it has to go back, our City Hall will be open to the public so that they'll be able to see it not just virtually like they're seeing it now, but in person, because it is a beautiful, beautiful piece. So thank you very much. And now I will move forward and introduce our next speaker, who is Kara Dedman, who is currently the museum curator at the North Carolina State Capitol. She holds a BA and an MA in public history. Prior to beginning at the Capitol, Kara was the assistant manager at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum. In 2019, she attended the Smithsonian Institution Interpreting African American History and Culture workshop, and she is a certified interpretive guide with the National Association of Interpretation. At the Capitol, Kara focuses on a more inclusive historic narrative, interpreting the Capitol's antebellum use of enslaved labor, emphasizing marginalized voices through exhibits, and continuing to contextualize the legacies of white supremacy presented on the Capitol grounds. Kara is a native North Carolinian that now resides in Durham, North Carolina, with her husband and a myriad of animals. And the title of her presentation is North Carolina's History with the 19th Amendment and the State's She Changed the World Traveling Exhibit. Welcome, Kara Dedman.
Thank you, Mayor Alexander, and thank you for having me, everyone. I am going to share my screen with you. I have a few images. Okay. Like Mayor Alexander noted, my name is Kara Dedman, and I am the museum curator at the North Carolina State Capitol. I have been invited to speak with you today about women's suffrage and about the 19th Amendment and its history in North Carolina. So I do work at the state capitol. It's pictured here at the bottom of the screen. I'm actually in my office at the Capitol today. We are the 1840 Capitol. Oftentimes, folks refer to us as the old Capitol, and that hurts our hearts a little bit because we are the historic Capitol, but remain the active capital of the state of North Carolina. The General Assembly served in this building from 1840 until 1961. And when the legislature moved out in 61, it was decided that the upper floors of the building would be used primarily for historic interpretation. So as a museum space, we have tours, exhibits, all kinds of things that interpret the history of North Carolina. At the Capitol, we frequently talk about citizenship rights, what it means to be a citizen in a democracy or in a representative government. So voting and enfranchisement fit directly into our site's mission and history. Obviously, we're very excited to take part in the commemoration of the 19th Amendment and dive deeper into that part of North Carolina's story. So the Capitol is part of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. DNCR, and DNCR has recognized the passage of the 19th Amendment with She Changed the World, NC Women Breaking Barriers. This is a department-wide initiative that commemorates the 19th Amendment and women's history in the state. So from the department, that's this language here, She Changed the World, North Carolina Women Breaking Barriers is an initiative by NC DNCR, which celebrates the achievements of North Carolina women and explores the diversity of their experiences and impact on our history. Of course, this commemoration also recognizes that the 19th was not a complete victory for all women. And so we strive to tell a fuller story of the full fight for equality of all North Carolina women. This initiative is a series of programs, exhibits, partnerships, and general awareness of women in North Carolina's history, and again, especially in the fight for full equality. So She Changed the World actually began here at the state capitol last September with a kickoff event at which a diverse collective of community partners discussed what the 19th Amendment and what suffrage meant for them as individuals or as groups. So most of our partners for this community event were representative of historically marginalized communities. So really it was a discussion of, again, how the 19th was not a complete victory and how this work carried forward into the 20th century. Some of our partners included historically Black sororities. You can see down there at the bottom, Delta Sigma Theta, the National Council of Negro Women, American Indian Women of Proud Nations, and the League of Women Voters. And of course, Historic Sites was well represented. That's the people in historic dress there. So it is important to commemorate and explore the history of voting because voting is an act of public engagement that most Americans would consider a very basic citizenship right. Elections and the right to participate in them through voting occupies a key place in our democracy, as it provides a means to ensure other personal rights, liberties, and representation. But as we're probably aware, we wouldn't be commemorating this date, or I wouldn't be here talking to you if that was always the case in the United States. And initially, voting began in our country as a right applied exclusively to white Protestant landowning men. Anyone not fitting into that very specific set of parameters historically has fought for the right to vote. Despite an appeal to remember the ladies by our second First Lady, Abigail Adams, the framers of our country and our Constitution promoted only white male suffrage. Over time, the cause of women's suffrage has been visited by different groups in our history, and it has become inextricably linked to other prominent social movements, including abolition and temperance. Following the Civil War and emancipation, African-American men were enfranchised with the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, but notably women were left out of consideration at that time. In many states, Black men only retained the right to vote and hold public office for a very limited amount of time, as the end of the 19th century saw the passage of codified segregation, a system of laws we now call Jim Crow. These measures included poll taxes and literacy tests, and they were mechanisms specifically designed to reduce the political power of African Americans. So supporters of women's suffrage actually reorganized their efforts in the early 20th century. During World War I, women supported the war effort and pointed out that they were just as capable of serving in roles outside of the domestic sphere and just as worthy of complete citizenship rights as men. By the war's end, many of North Carolina's newspapers, organizations, and politicians supported suffrage. So there was a small anti-suffrage movement in North Carolina as well, but supporters far outnumbered those anti-suffragists. Gertrude Weil, pictured here, helped found the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League in 1917, and by 1919, she was the organization's president. The league was actually headquartered here in Raleigh, a block from where I'm seated right now. You can see the exterior and the interior of the league's headquarters there. And in 1919 and 1920, as the fight for women's suffrage came to a crucial moment in our state, Wheel's work in North Carolina was a powerful motivator. And it's also important, we've already said this, it's important to reiterate that Black women supported suffrage in great numbers, but they were barred from full participation in white women's political groups. So the mainstream suffrage movement participated in racially discriminatory practices and even condoned white supremacist ideologies in order to garner support from Southern white women. Consequently, African-American men and women became increasingly marginalized and discriminated against at suffrage meetings, in campaigns, and in marches, leading Black women to form their own local and regional and national suffrage clubs and organizations. So notably in 1896, Mary Church Terrell founded the National Association of Colored Women. We already mentioned Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I used to work at her museum here in North Carolina. You can visit it when it's a state historic site in Sedalia, so in Guilford County. And in addition to founding Palmer Memorial Institute, the school on that site, Dr. Brown was a very staunch supporter of suffrage, and she was the president of the North Carolina Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She helped promote suffrage here in North Carolina, and she actually tried to get white club women to support suffrage for Black women as well. So during the 19 teens, there were a series of efforts in North Carolina to pass a suffrage bill, but they were consistently tabled. And actually, initially, when this idea came up in the North Carolina General Assembly, the bill was sent to the Committee on Insane Asylums. So that was the legislators showing, supporters of women's suffrage what they felt about women's suffrage. But there were these consistent efforts throughout the 19-teens in North Carolina. In June of 1919, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, which was mentioned, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was submitted to the states for ratification. So when the North Carolina legislature met to decide on ratification of that amendment on August 10th, 1920, both North Carolina and Tennessee were considering ratifying the suffrage amendment. And either of those states would be the last state needed for federal ratification. So North Carolina actually sent a telegram to Tennessee asking that Tennessee not ratify the amendment, and saying that North Carolina would do the same and not ratify, and thus the amendment would not pass. We know that didn't happen. And by August 18th, Tennessee had ratified. So North Carolina took no stance on the 19th Amendment at that time. But women officially gained the right to vote in the United States when the amendment was certified on August 26th. So North Carolina didn't officially ratify the 19th Amendment until 1971. So only Mississippi took longer to ratify, and they actually waited until 1984. Of course, it was federal law. The majority of states had ratified, and the law took effect in all states, guaranteeing that women could vote and hold public office. Now, we've already touched on this a little bit, but coming back to the idea, the fight for full suffrage was not over with the passage of the 19th Amendment. In many states, the amendment guaranteed only white women the right to vote, North Carolina being one of those states. In 1924, Native Americans born in the United States were declared to be citizens. So before this time, tribal citizenship was more important than United States citizenship. But of course, that didn't guarantee the right to vote in elections. And even after they were declared to be full citizens, it took several more decades for Native Americans to be guaranteed the right to vote as citizens. Oh, sorry, there's the amendment. I skipped a slide. So in southern states, voting continued to be an issue for African Americans. States were still suppressing voting with poll taxes, excuse me, with complicated literacy tests, and with the grandfather clause, which prevented individuals with African American ancestry from voting. So civil rights protests garnered increasing and more organized support in the 1960s, which pressured the federal government to eliminate systematic segregation, especially in the areas of education, public accommodations, and voter suppression. On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. This was after the Civil Rights Act was passed in the year prior. The Voting Rights Act prohibited any practice that denied the right to vote to citizens on the basis of race. It also forced historically prejudicial and discriminatory districts, particularly the southern states, to submit any changes to their election processes for federal approval. The Voting Rights Act has been renewed and expanded several times in the decades following its enacting, and it remains the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. Extensions of the Voting Rights Act were passed in 1975, and they actually guaranteed that bilingual ballots be used in certain areas, which was guaranteeing greater presence for Latino women. It is important to note, while we commemorate the 19th and recognize its importance in our history, we use it to examine the full story of all North Carolina women, even those who did not mark the amendment as a victory. That is what the She Changed the World commemoration seeks to do. And that is what I hope that my presentation conveyed to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. That was really excellent. And before we move on to the questions from the public, I just want to take a moment and say thank you to Kelly Baker, who is the master of this Zoom process, and without whom this would not have been possible. So she has coordinated, she has done all the behind the scenes, and I just want to do a shout out to Kelly Baker. Thank you. And so now what we will do is move on to see if we have any questions. Kelly, do you have?
The Q&A should be open if anyone and any of the attendees would like to ask a question. At the moment, I don't see any questions out there. If you would like to enter a question, or if you would like to raise your hand, I can try to find you that way and perhaps ask the question.
Okay, we have a question. I think we have one.
Can I say something real quick?
Yes.
I wanted to thank Kara and tell her that I went and saw the exhibit and I was so impressed with it. I went to see it at the Mars Hill Public Library on the campus at Mars Hill University. And I really loved the exhibit that was curated and put on. I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you probably saw the department's exhibit on She Changed the World, which includes both suffrage and anti-suffrage memorabilia and ephemera. But I actually did not curate that exhibit, but no, it's a great exhibit. So I'm really glad that you got to see it. I actually curated a She Changed the World exhibit that focuses on women's health and personal autonomy through health. So it relates directly to suffrage.
It looks like we have one question. There's not a name associated with the person that raised their hand. If you'd like to ask the question.
Yes. Can you hear me, Kelly?
Yes.
Barbara. Okay. First, I wanted to thank Mayor Alexander for hosting this and for the speakers. I'm a member of the Public Art Committee, Mary, and we were so thrilled that you submitted your piece for exhibit, and everyone, which was a cross section of and a very diverse section of Salisbury, was thrilled to host it. And then the mayor did offer to put it in City Hall, which is a perfect place. But then, of course, the pandemic hit, and it's been hard for lots of people. But I wanted to thank you all for doing this, and especially in this hard time, and tell you, and I loved, Kara, I learned things today that I did not know about. I thought that I knew when we had passed this, but in 1971, it's long, it's not even that far back. So, and, but thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for giving us this opportunity to experience this.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have two questions. One, it says, here's a tough one, and I'm assuming this is for all three of our panelists. Would we have fewer wars and better health care and child care if we took away the right of men to vote?
So historically, anti-suffrage supporters were worried about what women would focus on. In North Carolina, we had a very powerful textile lobby, as they did in Tennessee as well. And it was thought that if women retained the right to vote, that they would vote on improved working conditions in the textile mills and on, reduced hours for child labor. So there's always been feelings that women support causes collectively that are important to women. So I'm not sure if we took voting away from men. if that would be the answer to avoid those things. But definitely historically, it's been an argument against women's suffrage to, again, because of the causes that women would be thought of to support. Mary, did you have a comment on that?
I don't think we can go that far.
I personally think that the right to vote should be easier to attain. It's becoming more and more common to see voter registration drives and public events. We had one at the She Changed the World event. I know that the Museum of History regularly has them at their events where they just invite a representative to make sure people are registered. So any elimination of barriers to voting, more voting, that's what we need.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we have another question, and this is probably for each of the panelists as well. What is the one takeaway from the struggle of the 19th Amendment? Our children need to be cognizant of the work and pain our ancestors endured. What is one thing you want them to remember?
Well, I'll go first. The thing that I think is most worth remembering about the 19th is that it was not a complete guaranteed victory for all women. I gave a tour of the Capitol last year to a former U.S. congressman. And as I explained that the 19th was not a complete victory and it only really guaranteed voting for white women, he stopped me, politely, but he asked me to expand upon that because he had never heard that before. And I was kind of jarred that a congressman would not approach the amendment in that way. So I think that that's the most important takeaway, is that the 19th, of course, should be celebrated as a landmark legislative decision. But we should take a step back and realize that it was not a complete victory for all women, and that the fight for full equality for all women continued throughout the 20th century. It continues today.
Kelly,
Yes.
Dee Wright has a question.
Sure.
So I'm going to.
Can you hear me, Kelly?
Yes.
I want to know if either of them can tie in the abolition movement relative to the suffragette, especially Sojourner Truth and the abolition movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely, the causes of suffrage and abolition were very linked prior to the Civil War. So the two sides often supported each other. At the first group of assembled women to fight for full political rights, it was the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And Frederick Douglass was the only Black person at that assemblage of entirely white women. And Douglass actually, out of that meeting, out of that convention, they produced the Declaration of Sentiments, which reworded the Declaration of Independence to include all men and women. And it was actually Douglass that spoke passionately in favor of women's suffrage, and convinced the other delegates at that convention to add suffrage into their Declaration of Sentiments. So those two causes obviously were very linked from their beginning. As time moved forward and as the Civil War approached, abolition and emancipation became the more forefront of the two causes. And there were white women in the suffrage movement that were resentful of that, that said, how can we, guarantee suffrage or freedom for all if women are not included in that equation? And after emancipation, there were undeniable white supremacist ideologies that existed in the suffrage movement. So they were linked. Abolition was a part of women's suffrage, but there was definitely kind of a split. after the war. And they were all kind of tied into this like idea of progressive politics. But definitely you saw, again, kind of a split, a void in the suffrage movement as time moved forward. And now I apologize, I can't speak specifically to Sojourner Truth and her history, but I assume she was both an abolitionist and a suffragist as well, as many, many Black women were.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a question for Mary. How can someone acquire a pictorial postmark envelope from Mary?
You'd have to contact me at my website, and that I'm the only person that can get it to you. If you notice, I designed two of them. One was done for the Suffrage Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization here in Knoxville, Tennessee. And the other one was just a generic one that says Votes for Women with the yellow roses and things. So I designed two of them. And then the pictorial postmark has the lady with the hat and the roses on her hat. So it's kind of a generic symbol of the whole suffrage movement. But I'm happy to get those to you. And we did have a stamp expo here in Knoxville. The Knoxville Philatelic Society has a show every so many years at a big convention center. And we had those, and we had several versions. There were student contests in all the schools, I think nationally, and they had a lot of the student ones on display also. So they're quite collectible. And you might know that the post office has an official postage stamp that's going to come out supposedly the 22nd of this month. And it's a picture of ladies holding up banners, sort of marching and parading down the street. My stamps were designed by me and approved by the post office, but the post office only has one official stamp, and that's that one with the ladies parading with the stamps. So you can put that on there on one of my envelopes, and then I can postmark it for you with my pictorial postmark. And my web address was maryrudin.com. I hope that answers your question.
That's exciting. You'll be receiving a bunch, I'm sure.
Oh, goodness. Okay. I'll be happy to give some to the Public Art Committee and to the Salisbury, and because you guys have been wonderful and very supportive of the arts.
Well, we have really enjoyed your piece and this presentation as well, and as well for Kara. Thank you so much. This was really excellent.
We have one comment, I suppose, as a follow-up to the 19th Amendment. This person wanted us to know that North Carolina ratified the Equal Right Amendment that held together the necessary 75% state ratification.
Okay.
Yes.
And did they have a date for that? Was that?
The ERA continues to be litigated, the Equal Rights Amendment. This is an effort that's existed for decades, and the participant is exactly right. It's failed to garner the majority state support for ratification. We had several community partners at our She Changed the World kickoff event that still actively campaign for the ERA. And again, this is why we recognize the 19th and commemorate its passage, and know that there is still work to be done for full equality, and the fight continues.
State shot.
Wow. It just seems incredible that we're still fighting for it. But yeah. I was shocked at the information about 1971. That's when they ratified the women.
Yeah. Generally, when amendments become federally ratified, the states that did not pass them kind of do it like ceremonially. And then North Carolina very specifically chose not to do that because, again, there was anti-suffrage support in North Carolina, particularly in the members of our General Assembly. And so they chose to do nothing. And it didn't matter. North Carolina had the first woman to sit in any legislature in the southern United States. She served here in our house. Her name was Lillian Exum Clement. And you might be familiar with Lillian's List. It is a non-profit, nonpartisan organization that helps women register, and it promotes women's suffrage still. So, yeah.
When was that done, Kara? What date was that?
When was Clement elected?
Yes.
So she actually ran in the Democratic primary before women were widely guaranteed the right to vote, so before the amendment's passage. And she was elected in fall of 1920. So she began serving in our legislature in 1921. So we often say in the Capitol that Clement was elected before women could vote, or before she could vote for herself. That's not entirely true, but it is, it's a half truth there.
Okay. Well, that is so wonderful.
Mayor, I don't see any further questions. If anyone wants to chime in or raise their hand, I'm happy to call on you or to read your question. But if not, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to wrap up then and say again, thank you, Kelly Baker, for doing such an excellent job building the questions. And Mary Rudin, thank you so much. We are really enjoying. I get to pass that every day as I'm coming up the stairs to the mayor's office. So I have particularly enjoyed it. And Kara, thank you for such a broad look at the women's suffrage in context of the broader, particularly how difficult it was for our African American citizens, and that we're still fighting for the ERA even today. I would like to ask you, if it's possible, would you send Kelly so that we can send it out to everyone? Any upcoming events that will be around the state, so that if any of us are traveling, our families traveling, that they would have an opportunity to take the children there. And I would love to share it with our school system for any small group that they might be able to take kids to. Because I think this is so important. And we have recorded this event, so we can share it as well. So if you can either state it now, so it'll be on this recorder, but also to give to Kelly so that we can get it out to our boards and commissions as well.
Sure. Both. I'm happy to do both. So the website is NCDCR, stands for North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources.gov/She Changed the World. And that is kind of the landing page of the department's commemoration. So, touring exhibit information will be there, other affiliated events. Some of our community partners are putting on their own events with just kind of the department's backing. The League of Women Voters is doing that across the state.
Are they listed separately?
No, they all should be there together.
Okay.
And yeah, absolutely. A lot of our events and the exhibit and things look different now because of COVID, obviously. But that page should still have updated information on the department's commemoration, which we're actually extending for another year because of the pandemic.
Okay. And Mary, are there any place that we should go or direct people for more information about your presentation or events that might be somewhere in North Carolina?
I think just my website, maryrudin.com, and my quilts are traveling to a couple of museums, but that's in Tennessee, and one is outside Atlanta in Georgia, and that sort of thing. But I think that would be the main thing. And I just think everybody should try and stop by and take a look at the statue, and all mothers tell their children to please vote.
That's right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
really, really enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
All the people who attended as well. We appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Do we
Thank you,
have
everyone.
one more question?
I don't believe so. There was a question about the PowerPoints. I have the one, and I can get with Kara about her presentation as well to share that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Those would be great for some of our schools here locally if we can share those, both if we have your permission
Sure.
to do that. Okay. Well, thank you both so much. Safe travels to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.